This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. You trade markets. You invest in markets. A market could be a stock. It could be an index. It could be a commodity. It could be gold. It could be silver. It could be palladium. It could be oil. It could be a currency. It could be the Swiss franc. It could be a bond. They're all markets. People buying and selling. There might be different fundamentals behind all of those markets. I'm sure there are quite different fundamentals behind all of those markets. But people are the same. People buy and sell with the same motivations, the same rationales. And at the end of the day, there's great evidence that ignoring the fundamentals and going straight to the price action, straight to what that market is being traded at right now, is the best way to go about long-term success. Let me clarify about markets. Someone asked me the other day, they said, where do I learn to start trading stocks? And I said, well, stocks are just a market or an instrument depending on what you mean. But just saying I want to trade stocks or you trade stocks, that's not a strategy. And just to take the concept of markets a little bit further along, there's many ways you can trade those markets that I just mentioned. Many, what I would call instruments. Most people call them instruments. You can trade stocks with just standard stocks, standard equities. You can trade stocks with futures. You can trade stocks with ETFs. You can trade stocks with Leaps options. There are multiple types of instruments you can trade markets with. Where am I going with all this? It's this insanity where people get caught up in instruments and markets. And the reality is what you should be concerned about is the strategy. What strategy are you employing? Don't get hung up on the instrument. Don't get hung up on the market. Oh, I don't know anything about currencies. I can't trade currencies. Guess what? You don't know anything about stocks either. Oh, I know everything about Facebook. No, you don't. You absolutely, I know everything about Apple. Oh, really? How many people truly went long Apple 15 years ago and are sitting there today? Come on. You don't. No one knows what's going to happen tomorrow. No one has perfect fundamentals. There's no such thing as perfect fundamentals. There's no such thing as enough fundamentals. There's always more fundamentals. So the reality is we all face the situation. Are we going to trade markets? Yes. And what type of instrument are we going to use? Stocks, ETFs, futures, Leaps, perhaps something else. That is the choice. Those are the choices. That's the way you want to think about this game. Don't allow yourself to say, I can't trade currencies. I can't trade commodities. Commodities, ooh, that sounds scary. Commodities, that's risky. Guess what? The S&P can drop 50%, and it has twice in the last 15 years. The Shanghai can drop 30% in just a few months, and it has. So don't talk to me about risk on just some selected market or instrument. That's nonsensical. You trade these markets, you trade these instruments with a strategy, and you define your risk. Just saying a market is risky, come on, that's silly. That's not the way to think. My whole setup today of defining markets, defining instruments, and talking about strategy is to introduce a company called Commodities Corporation that was acquired by Goldman Sachs in 1997 for estimated to be around $100 million. At the time, they had about $2 billion in assets under management. So Commodities Corporation ceased to exist as a company that we could all kind of follow. They put out annual reports. Very famous traders work there. Goldman Sachs absorbed them. Still to this day, people read about Commodities Corporation literally every day in two of the most famous books about Wall Street. Jack Schwager's The Market Wizards and The New Market Wizards feature prominently, because Jack was associated with Commodities Corporation, feature prominently traders that were associated with working with Commodities Corporation. Paul Tudor Jones, Louis Bacon, Bruce Kobner, Michael Marcus, Ed Seykota. Those books very well could have mentioned Commodities Corporation prominently on the front cover. Given the largesse of some of the superstars that were inside, those books would have had a hard time coming into existence without the cooperation of so many legendary traders associated with Commodities Corporation. Let me read a few bio points about Commodities Corporation. The company was founded by Helmut Weimar and Amos Hofstadter with $2.5 million of capital in 1969. Weimar was a childhood friend of Hofstadter's son Amos Jr. and had studied commodities at MIT. As a result of his PhD thesis work on cocoa, Weimar took a job working for Nabisco in 1965. Hofstadter, who had been Weimar's mentor, had begun trading stocks and commodities in the 1930s working for Hayden Stone. Hofstadter, whose simple principles for trading are still widely circulated, joined the firm at the age of 67, trading part-time and working to create trading systems to be used by the entire firm. Among Commodities Corporation's other co-founders were Nobel laureate economist Paul Samuelson, who was also Weimar's thesis advisor, Paul Kuttner, an MIT professor, and Frank Vanderson, a colleague of Weimar's from Nabisco. Commodities Corporation would bring a large number of PhDs onto its payroll throughout the 1970s. They were originally founded to take advantage of trading opportunities in tradable physical commodities, but would later branch out into trading other futures such as currencies. I want to add to that from Wikipedia with an excerpt from Fortune, 1981. Quote, "Despite the academic trappings, the company is a model of bustling entrepreneurship. Commodities Corporation barely owns anything that can't be turned into cash in a matter of hours. It's like a big pile of money," end quote. Now that speaks to trading liquid instruments. 1981 outlining quite clearly a benefit that you still want today. Can you get out of it? Can you get out of that market? Look what's happening in China right now. Very difficult to get out. Absolutely very difficult to get out if you want to get out. Many types of restrictions. And that's not to say we could not see the same thing in America. We absolutely could see the same thing. But your best strategy is to start with liquidity. Can you enter and exit the markets you're going to trade with relative ease? That really has to be the start of your process. Just for a few minutes, I want to take a sidetrack though. I want to take a sidetrack from Commodities Corporation to insert an audio clip from the physicist Richard Feynman. His very straightforward and clear to understand definition, explanation of the scientific method is critical.
Now I'm going to discuss how we would look for a new law. In general, we look for a new law by the following process. First, we guess it. Then we well, don't laugh, that's really true. Then we compute the consequences of the guess to see what, if this is right, if this law that we guessed is right, we see what it would imply, and then we compare those computation results to nature, or we say compare to experiment or experience, compare it directly with observation to see if it works. If it disagrees with experiment, it's wrong. In that simple statement is the key to science. It doesn't make a difference how beautiful your guess is, it doesn't make a difference how smart you are who made the guess, or what his name is. If it disagrees with experiment, it's wrong. That's all there is to it. It's therefore not unscientific to take a guess, although many people who are not in science think it is. For instance, I had a conversation about flying saucers some years ago with laymen. Because I'm scientific, I know all about flying saucers. So I said, I don't think there are flying saucers. So my antagonist said, Is it impossible that there are flying saucers? Can you prove that it's impossible? I said, no, I can't prove it's impossible. It's just very unlikely. That, they say, you are very unscientific. If you can't prove it impossible, then how can you say it's likely, that it's unlikely? Well, that's the way, that is scientific. It is scientific only to say what's more likely and less likely, and not to be proving all the time possible and impossible. To define what I mean, I finally said to him, listen, I mean that from my knowledge of the world that I see around me, I think that it is much more likely that the reports of flying saucers are the result of the known irrational characteristics of terrestrial intelligence rather than the unknown rational efforts of extraterrestrial intelligence. It's just more likely, that's all. And it's a good guess. And we always try to guess the most likely explanation, keeping in the back of the mind the fact that if it doesn't work, then we must discuss the other possibilities. There was, for instance, for a while, a phenomenon called superconductivity. There still is the phenomenon, which is that metals conduct electricity without resistance at low temperatures, and it was not at first obvious that this was a consequence of the known laws with these particles, but it turns out that it has been thought through carefully enough, and it's seen, in fact, to be a consequence of known laws. There are other phenomena, such as extrasensory perception, which cannot be explained by this known knowledge of physics here, and it is interesting, however, that phenomenon has not been well established, and that we cannot guarantee that it's there. So if it could be demonstrated, of course that would prove that the physics is incomplete, and therefore it's extremely interesting to physicists, whether it's right or wrong, and many experiments exist which show it doesn't work. The same goes for astrological influences. If it were true that the stars could affect the day that it was good to go to the dentist, then, as in America we have that kind of astrology, then it would be wrong. The physics theory would be wrong, because there's no mechanism understandable in principle from these things that would make it go. And that's the reason that there's some skepticism among scientists with regard to those ideas. Now you see, of course, that with this method we can disprove any definite theory. You have a definite theory, a real guess from which you can really compute consequences which could be compared to experiment, and in principle we can get rid of any theory. We can always prove any definite theory wrong. Notice, however, we never prove it right. Suppose that you invent a good guess, calculate the consequences, and discover that every consequence that you calculate agrees with experiment. The theory is then right? No, it is simply not proved wrong. Because in the future, there could be a wider range of experiments, you can compute a wider range of consequences, and you may discover then that the thing is wrong. That's why laws like Newton's laws for the motion of planets last such a long time. He guessed the law of gravitation, calculated all the kinds of consequences for the solar system and so on, compared them to experiment, and it took several hundred years before the slight error of the motion of Mercury was developed. During all that time, the theory had been failed to be proved wrong and could be taken to be temporarily right, but it can never be proved right, because tomorrow's experiment may succeed in proving what you thought was right wrong. So we never are right, we can only be sure we're wrong. However, it's rather remarkable that we can last so long. I mean, have some idea which will last so long. I must also point out to you that you cannot prove a vague theory wrong. If the guess that you make is poorly expressed and rather vague, and the method that you use for figuring out the consequences is rather a little vague, you're not sure, I mean, you say, I think everything's because it's all due to Mughals, and Mughals do this and that more or less, so I can sort of explain how this works, then you see that that theory is good because it can't be proved wrong. If the process of computing the consequences is indefinite, then with a little skill, any experimental result can be made to look like an expected consequence. You're probably familiar with that in other fields. For example, A hates his mother. The reason is, of course, because she didn't caress him or love him enough when he was a child. Actually, if you investigate, you find out that, as a matter of fact, he did love him very much and everything was all right. Well, then, it's because she was overindulgent when he was a child. So by having a vague theory, it's possible to get either result. Now, wait. Now, the cure for this one is the following. It would be possible to say, if it were possible to state ahead of time how much love is not enough and how much love is overindulgent exactly, and then there would be a perfectly legitimate theory against which you can make tests. It is usually said when this is pointed out, how much love is and so on, oh, you're dealing with psychological matters where things can't be defined so precisely. Yes, but then you can't claim to know anything about it. Now I want to concentrate from now on, because I'm a theoretical physicist, I'm more delighted with this end of the problem, as to what goes, how do you make the guesses. Now it's strictly, as I said before, not of any importance where the guess comes from. It's only important that it should agree with experiment, and that it should be definite as possible, as definite as possible. What you say then is very simple. We've set up a machine, a great computing machine, which has a random wheel in it that makes a succession of guesses. And each time it guesses a hypothesis about how nature should work, computes immediately the consequences, and makes a comparison to a list of experimental results it has at the other end. In other words, guessing is a dumb man's job. Actually, it's quite the opposite, and I will try to explain why. The first problem is how to start. You see, I'll start with all the known principles, but the principles that are all known are inconsistent with each other. So something has to be removed. So we get a lot of letters from people. We're always getting letters from people who are insisting that we ought to make holes in our guesses as follows. You see, you make a hole to make room for a new guess. Somebody says to you, people always say space is continuous, but how do you know when you get to a small enough dimension that there really are enough points in between? It isn't just a lot of dots separated by little distances. Or they say, you know those quantum mechanical amplitudes that you told me about, they're so complicated and absurd. What makes you think those are right? Maybe they aren't right. I get a lot of letters with such content, but I must say that such remarks are perfectly obvious and are perfectly clear to anybody who's working on this problem, and it doesn't do any good to point this out. The problem is not what might be wrong, but what might be substituted precisely in place of it. If you say anything precise, for example, in the case of a continuous space, suppose the precise proposition is that space really consists of a series of dots only, and the space between them doesn't mean anything, and the dots are in a cubic array. Then we can prove that immediately is wrong. That doesn't work. You see, the problem is not to change or to say something might be wrong, but to replace it by something, and that is not so easy. As soon as any real, definite idea is substituted, it becomes almost immediately apparent that it doesn't work. Secondly, there's an infinite number of possibilities of these simple types. It's something like this. You're sitting working very hard, you work for a long time trying to open a safe, and some Joe comes along who doesn't know anything about what you're doing or anything except that you're trying to open a safe. He says, you know, why don't you try the combination 10, 20, 30? Because you're busy, you're trying a lot of things. Maybe you already tried 10, 20, 30. Maybe you know that the middle number is already 32 and not 20. Maybe you know that, as a matter of fact, this is a 5-digit combination. There we have. So these letters don't do any good, and so please don't send me any letters trying to tell me how the thing is going to work. I read them to make sure that I haven't already thought of that. But it takes too long to answer them because I usually in the class try 10, 20, 30.
That scientific method was fundamental to Commodities Corporation. They all had that deep in their blood. They knew they had to prove. They knew they had to test. They knew they had to research. Why am I going off on a tangent about a company that was bought out by Goldman Sachs in 1997, reading from an article in 1981? Because this stuff is absolutely timeless. Absolutely timeless. And you know what? It gets harder and harder and harder for the average person to find examples of this type of thinking, of this type of success. Because guess what? The people that know how to do this don't really want to talk about it as much today. You can't find as many great articles today. You can't find Amos Hofstadter's rules published like he did. I mean, you can go find them. But I'm just saying the contributions, their desire at the time to prove that they were seeing something different, there's less of that today. So for me, I see no problem in reaching back to a firm that was making a ton of money in the 1970s and early 1980s and using that example today because it's 100% timeless. Let me continue with an excerpt from Fortune, the magazine, 1981. Commodities Corporation's traders were then disciples of fundamental analysis. In commodities, as in the stock market, fundamental and technical analysis are the two major schools of investing. The fundamentalist studies the economic realities, supply and demand factors, that underlie market values. The technician focuses on price and market volume information and examines past trends in the belief that old patterns will repeat themselves. Now, just for me to interject here for a second, some of what I'm going to read, we have to keep in mind, this is the author of the magazine article writing. Not everything in terms of uniformity on language and definition is perfect, but I think you'll get my point as I finish reading this. Continuing. As a fundamentalist, Weimar fed the cocoa model he developed in his thesis with a vast array of supply and demand information. He compiled the history of rainfall and humidity for the cocoa-growing countries of Africa and correlated it with the size of the harvest. That enabled him to evaluate the maturing crops in the plantations of Ghana and Ivory Coast before publication of government figures, which were often inaccurate anyway. Weimar hired his own cocoa pod counter, a German who toured African cocoa fields in a Land Rover, examining the same cocoa trees several times during the growing season, and recording the number, length, and condition of the pods. And as a humorous aside in this article, since a cocoa tree is as tall as an apple tree and contains about 25 pods, the counter at times suffered from a stiff neck. To make matters worse, the Land Rover broke down a lot. Despite their thoroughness, the fundamentalist traders didn't perform much better than the Land Rover. In 1970, its first year, Commodities Corporation lost $100,000. At a board meeting, Weimar and Vanderson proposed diversifying by developing a technical trading system. Samuelson, as an aside, who went on to win the Nobel Prize and really thought markets were a rational situation. At a board meeting, Weimar and Vanderson proposed diversifying by developing a technical trading system. Samuelson and Kuttner, firm adherents of the random walk theory for commodities as well as stocks, tried to discourage the idea. How a commodities price changed yesterday, they contended, tells an investor nothing about how it will perform tomorrow. Amos Hofstadter sided with Weimar. The trader Weimar affectionately referred to as our 70-year-old guru was basically a fundamentalist. But he also followed price patterns. Hofstadter never bucked a trend in prices for long, no matter what the fundamentalists said. When he decided that a market's supply and demand prospects looked good, he put up 1/3 of his ultimate position. If he lost 25% of that stake, he'd get out. Quote, "Never mind the cheese," he'd crack. "Let me out of the trap." If the market swung his way, he'd add another third, taking a final position when prices had climbed half as high as he thought they'd go. Commodities Corporation paid Hofstadter the tribute of computerizing the history of some of his old accounts to examine how he'd built a position as prices shifted. These studies became informal guidelines for the firm's other traders. Hofstadter himself learned Fortran, a computer language, so he could help out with programming, as he did for 7 years until he died in a 1977 auto accident. Quote, "He was the most remarkable investor I ever knew," end quote, says Samuelson. "He made money in commodities 50 years straight." Now you see why, is an interjection for me, you see why now I laid out that foundation in the beginning about commodities and trading. Hofstadter did not make money in commodities 50 years straight. He traded a system that made money in commodities 50 years straight. This author simply did not know how to phrase accurately what these guys were doing. The article continues. The challenge was to make his methods reproducible for others who didn't have his flair or caliber. At Hofstadter's urging, Weimar assigned Vanderson to set up a technical system known as trend following. In its simplest form, trend following instructs a speculator to buy a commodity whenever the price goes up and sell it when the price goes down. An investor has to get in or out of the commodity every time the price reverses so that he's constantly whipsawed by small losses. The goal, of course, is to outstrip those losses by catching a long upward or downward move. Now, I give the author credit there. He does define trend following, but you can see the confusion in this author writing this piece in 1981. Sure, Commodities Corporation started off as a fundamental shop. That's the direction they were going. but it didn't last long. They were a trend-following shop, an absolute trend-following shop, dominated by men like Bruce Kovner, Michael Marcus, Ed Seykota, Louis Bacon, Paul Tudor Jones, men that all understand trend-following deep in their gut. Mechanical trend-following, systematic trend-following. This was not about fundamentals. Now, I think if you read between the lines, you can see what Commodities Corporation was doing. And they are very clear, ultimately, that they were trend followers. I want to add one small clip from the Nobel laureate Paul Samuelson, who was one of the original investors in Commodities Corporation. So here's a man that does not believe it's possible for trend-following traders to make money.
Your asset allocation?
No comment.
Your suggested asset allocation, is it still 50, 25, 25?
Well, I'll tell you the most important question that vexes the minds of people like me on the Finance Committee of the National Academy of Sciences is the following. The evidence is overwhelming that 1,000 timers try to buy when stocks are low and sell when they're high is a damnably awful record. And it isn't so hard to sell, but you don't know when to get back in. And typically, things move very, very fast in normal cycles when they go back. What should you think when somebody as wise as Alan Greenspan says this is a once-in-a-century event? Should you still, in that case, take in no sale at all? And that's a very hard decision.
He believes in the random walk. It is absolutely not possible from his perspective, and he's got a Nobel Prize to his credit. But he was smart enough, or cagey enough, how one might want to phrase it, smart enough or cagey enough to help fund the start of Commodities Corporation. And even then, did not appreciate where the traders, the technical traders like Hofstadter, wanted to go in the firm. He didn't appreciate it and said, hey, this isn't going to work. So here was the man with the Nobel Prize, believes in the random walk, but makes a fortune selling his stake in a company that's primarily a trend-following trader. Don't you just love history? Don't you just love how the world really works? That doesn't mean Samuelson was a bad guy. I'm sure he's not. I've watched some of his old videos. He's obviously brilliant. They don't give Nobel Prizes out to guys that aren't very, very bright and very accomplished. But on the margins, when you start to examine what really happens in the world, this secretive strategy of trend following has just woven itself throughout time. And if you look closely, you can find it. You won't see it if you just say to yourself, how do I trade stocks? Or how do I trade commodities? It is not about the market. It's not about the instrument. It's about your strategy. And if you don't have a strategy, you are simply rolling the dice, gambling. Go LexisNexis search everything you can about Commodities Corporation. If you want to feel confident, if you want to feel comfortable in the people that have come before you doing these things that I'm talking about, the evidence is there. The people that were doing this 4 and 5 decades ago, you can find their insights. You can find all of those great ideas that they illuminate. It's there. But you've got to be hungry. You've got to want it. You've got to dig in. And the challenge is to find a life. And I think it is binary. It's a choice. Up or down, heads or tails. Which way are you going to go? If you choose heads, and you take the risk, there's no guarantee it's going to work out. As Jim Rogers has said, and I'm paraphrasing, if you go down that path to run the 4-minute mile, to be the Kirov ballerina, to make your first million, you might not end up being that sweet, lovable self you were when you were 17. Because to get to that end goal requires complete dedication. There is no deviation. You must dedicate. Oh, I just want to have a nice lifestyle. Well, guess what? You're going to be like your guy living next door to you. You're going to be in the cookie cutter suburban neighborhood. And that's it. That's the legacy. I'm not necessarily saying that's bad. Who am I to say? Everyone has to make their choices. I'm just painting a picture for you. If you do want something else, if you want to spend your lifetime trying to make something really big happen, there's a different way to think about it. And this clip expresses that desire in a very odd, unique, fascinating, hit you in the stomach sort of way.
How much?
69 cents.
And the gas?
Y'all getting any rain up your way?
What way would that be?
I seen you was from Dallas.
What business is it of yours? Where I'm from? Friendo?
I didn't mean nothing by it.
Didn't mean nothing.
Just passing the time. If you don't want to accept that, I don't know what else I can do for you. Will there be something else?
I don't know. Will there?
Is something wrong
With what?
with anything?
Is that what you're asking me? Is there something wrong with anything?
Will there be anything else?
You already asked me that.
Well, I need to see about closing now.
See about closing.
Yes, sir.
What time do you close?
Now, we close now.
Now is not a time. What time do you close?
Generally around dark, at dark.
You don't know what you're talking about, do you?
Sir?
I said, you don't know what you're talking about. What time do you go to bed?
Sir?
You're a bit deaf, aren't you? I said, what time do you go to bed?
Somewhere around 9:30. I'd say around 9:30.
I could come back then.
Why would you be coming back? We'll be closed.
Yeah, you said that.
Well, I got to close now.
You live in that house out back.
Yes, I do.
You lived here all your life?
This is my wife's father's place originally.
You married into it?
We lived in Temple, Texas for many years. Raised a family there in Temple. We come out here about 4 years ago.
You married into it?
That's the way you want to put it.
I don't have some way to put it. That's the way it is. What's the most you ever lost on a coin toss?
Sir?
The most you ever lost on a coin toss?
I don't know. I couldn't say.
Call it.
Call it.
Yes.
For what?
Just call it.
Well, we need to know what we're calling it for here.
You need to call it. I can't call it for you. Well, it wouldn't be fair.
I didn't put nothing up.
Yes, you did. You've been putting it up your whole life. You just didn't know it. You know what date is on this coin?
No?
1958. It's been traveling 22 years to get here. And now it's here. And it's either heads or tails. And you have to say, call it.
Well, look, I need to know what I stand to win.
Everything.
How's that?
You stand to win everything, call it.
All right. Heads then.
Well done. Don't put it in your pocket.
Sir?
Don't put it in your pocket. It's your lucky quarter.
Where you want me to put it?
Anywhere not in your pocket. Or it'll get mixed in with the others and become just a coin. Which it is.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.